That's the program I'm going to reintroduce a bit today after I've said what happened yesterday and who we are as an organization. Through the day, you're going to find that we're not trying to do this on our own. We have already had several of these speakers and we're handing the floor over to other speakers because we know that if you have a completely overconfident title to your conference like Lifting Neighborhoods Out of Poverty, it would be ridiculous for one organization, let alone one program, to suggest that we had the answers. And even with this whole crowd of people, I don't think any of us have the hubris to think that we have the answers, but maybe there'll be some connections, and those personal connections, people who've done work where you can avoid running into the same walls that they did. That might be the sort of outcome we can have together. So yesterday we heard from Des McCart and Toby Lowe in a keynote speech, which was very interesting. We'll be able to send those around later as videos and presentations. So if you didn't see it, you won't feel too much like you've missed out. We also had Sue and Antje giving workshops. Everyone who remains on this, you'll hear from today, which should be really interesting. And I think they've got a diverse set of input. I'll briefly say something about housekeeping. We know there's some issues around the Zoom login. It's clearly been a challenge for lots of people. We've chosen a format which we probably wouldn't choose to do in exactly this way again, but where we've made life complicated for ourselves. But the reason for that is to make it feel a little bit more like a real conference. Real conferences aren't just about watching one person speak, video you can't interact with. It's about speaking to people in interactive workshop settings, in Q&As, and also maybe speaking to people around when you're standing in the queue. Maybe it's a queue for the toilets, you meet someone who's a network connection that'll be a professional asset for the rest of your life. We want to just try to create a few of those little moments in the short time we've got together this morning. In your email, if you've got this far, you've already seen at least one email from Dylan, who's the technical person that you can contact if you're having issues, if you drop out, if you're having some worries about it. Please do just send an email to Dylan. Our agenda is pretty busy for the day, but there is still time that we've tried to build in a comfort break in the middle and those breakout rooms as well. I'm going to explain to you through the day how to navigate between the first session, which you'll just up to the break. It's just us speaking at a podium here and 3 different speakers. I'll then explain that you'll go back into the lobby after your break. So you've come from the lobby into this first session, and then you'll have to go, you'll just close the Zoom session end that meeting, go back into the lobby, and you'll be able to see then 5 workshops, in fact, that are available for you to join. And you'll be able to pick any one of them. You might have signed up in advance, but you're welcome to join any workshop at any time. And then I'll explain that we'll come effectively a plenary session, and then you'll hear me speak and explain the rest of the setup from there. It's very straightforward, really. Just on the workshops, I'm afraid I almost got the number wrong because one of our workshop leads has had to drop out at the last minute. He sends his profuse apologies, and he confirms that he owes us a great big favor. So maybe we can all cash in on that great big favor from Ewan when it comes round. But there's a number of workshops. You might have already had a look at them, but during my presentation, I'll certainly tee up a couple of them. So before I talk about community renewal, lifting neighborhoods together as a program and the sort of whole person, whole place, whole system change that we're trying to do there, I thought I should talk about Community Renewal Trust as an organization. Community Renewal Trust started 20 years ago, and the camera might be flattering, but I wasn't here 20 years ago leading Community Renewal Trust, that's for sure. In fact, one of the workshops has been led by Paul, who for 20 years was the founder and chief exec. So I'll introduce a bit about our setup. Now, I've rather gone out on a limb here. These are not our current brands, but we're in the middle of a branding process. And in the spirit of just showing everything as it is as a process along the way, which is in keeping with this being the midpoint conference of our Lifting Neighborhoods Together program, I thought I'd just show you our working, right? We are not committed to any of these particular ways of doing our branding, but here we go. We thought we'd just show it to you anyway, that we're in the middle of a process in which we're trying to better represent that Community Renewal Trust in the center is a group structure. We're a place where people have a united set of approaches and thoughts, and I'll come on to that in a second. But actually, we're maybe better described as being 3 community development trusts. One in Pennywell, which is Muirhouse and West Pilton in Edinburgh. One with the Roma people, mostly based in Govan Hill in Glasgow, but that's a Roma-led organization. And one which we call Lifting Neighborhoods Together, because that's the name of the program, but acts as a community development trust in the neighborhood of Bingham, Magdalen and the Hayes in Edinburgh. So we've got those kind of three different local organizations that have a team that's trying to integrate and deliver holistic support across a range of disciplines. We also provide consultancy and training as a separate activity. And what I haven't actually written on here is we also run the only not-for-profit funeral directors, which is called Caledonia Cremation. So it didn't seem like it fitted with the pattern here, but we also do some work around that as well. As I say, we're just trying to get better at describing all the many, many things that we do all at once. What is it though that unites us across that group structure? One part of that's all about by Roma, for Roma work. One of them is in a neighborhood where there's a system change program, which is what we're going to talk about today. One of them is in another neighborhood where we're trying to make things work as a community development trust. But what unites 20 years of community renewal trust, I've tried to summarize in this little graphic. Our aim is to speak to people who are from the local areas in which we work and listen to them regardless of what they want to say to us. And often that's about elucidating, listening to things that they maybe weren't ready to say, finding the ways of unpicking what they might want to talk about, making it so there's no barriers to us sitting and building a relationship of listening with them. We want to connect people to the help they need. That's because we can't do everything ourselves at all, and people cannot navigate the system of all the support that's available in their neighborhood, let alone across their city or their local authority or their country. Things are extremely complicated, so we can help navigate people through that system. We help build on people's strengths. This is a really key part of what we do, is to take an approach that's all about building on people's strengths and not going into what I was describing yesterday as the fix-it paradigm. And then sticking with people for as long as it takes. Now, if we just give you the 1 second version of that, that sounds like what you end up with is you listen to thousands of people and you end up with an unmanageably massive number of people you're trying to support because you're sticking with all of them. But we say there's a difference between being available through what we'd call a golden thread, that people know they can always get in touch with us at short notice and speak to the same case manager they've maybe been working with for a long time. But they don't have to, and the onus is on them to go forward and do their own change in their life. That's part of building their strengths first and then saying, now we'll be sticking with you because it's your journey of transformation that you're on. We'll just be there if you need us. But sometimes it means we work intensively with people for months, if not years, because we need to stick with them and not give them some artificial deadline. We actually do this in a way where we have no core funding, for instance. We operate by delivering contracts which are full of KPIs, for instance, that are often public sector contracts that we need to deliver all sorts of KPIs and targets against. We deliver restricted grant funds for a whole range of different disciplines, each of which is its own project. It can be extremely confusing for those of us on the inside, including the frontline staff, it's worth saying. So I don't want to give the sense that some of the things I'm going to talk about are really easy. We're in a situation where there's lots and lots of things going on, and multidisciplinary working is always difficult in the third sector. The 20 years that we've been delivering, we sometimes describe as being 4 learning cycles. It's not that we did one cycle and then a second cycle. We never work in a linear way. We had one cycle get started, and then we've built on it with another whole cycle, and then another, and then finally the most recent one. So we're still going even on our first learning cycle in this front. But 20 years ago, what we were doing was saying, could we apply community development thinking and small neighborhood place-based thinking to how we dealt with particularly people getting into work? Could we make it, the very initial challenge was that we were able to deliver intermediate labor market jobs, not spread out across a massive local authority, but making it so there was a full employment area in a very small 5,000 to 10,000 person neighborhood that would otherwise have had a very low employment rate. What would happen if we started working in that space? So of course, over time, we've ended up delivering employability contracts, but pushing them to be more place-based and more about ending poverty than just moving people into work and then letting them go. We then had a wave, this is the second wave, it might not be intuitive which is the second, but it doesn't really matter. We then have a wave that said, what if that same kind of ethos that starts with doing work door-to-door, street work, to try to find people who need work in a neighborhood, what if we applied that to things like health promotion? What if we had an approach that worked for people with really complex health needs and mental health needs to provide assessment and casework on their terms? What would that look like And would that then be in a health setting, or is that a community setting? This is where we can combine a community development approach with health and well-being delivery. What if we were then having group sessions that are around people's self-care, trying to build self-management for people? What could be done in that space? What if we shared the kind of lessons that we're learning there in primary care? Maybe we deliver link working, for instance, to aid that. We've delivered training and transformative work with lots of GPs and primary care staff, so they can take this on, not us delivering. They can kind of learn the same lessons from this learning cycle. Throughout all that period, the bit of work we were doing, which was about community development, which is where we meet people, and instead of saying, "Hi, what's wrong with you? Let's fix you," and instead we say, "What do you want to do in your neighborhood? What would be an asset? How could you help your neighborhood?" was all done on a bit of a shoestring in terms of community development. But then we got the opportunity through National Lottery Community Fund's Our Place program, and also People's Health Trust local conversations, to deliver what ended up being £6 million of investment into five neighborhoods in total. And that was done through a process of community visioning and community capacity building that meant that they could lead their own community development, community capacity building, and community leadership work. So this was another learning cycle on top. And then more recently, the learning cycle that's ended up with this program is one that's all about place-based integration. What if we said, what if all of these learning cycles were all the same big learning cycle? What if we could try to combine all of that and include lots of things which we didn't already know about? That's why yesterday I was talking about how we break down silos and linear thinking, the fix-it culture, and what we do where people leave a deprived neighborhood when we work there to transform their lives. And over those years, we've actually ended up working in 17 neighborhoods. We've got thousands of people jobs and thousands of people matched into healthcare services. This is actually this is quite an old slide now and is out of date. We've far exceeded this. This doesn't even start to talk about the work we did with link workers, the BME support work we've done, the migration advice provision that we've provided, all the hundreds and hundreds of social groups and dozens of constituted community organizations that have spawned out of this work. So that's our background, and it resulted in this program, Community Renewal, Lifting Neighborhoods Together, which we're doing with a whole range of partners, as you can see there. It's £2 million, as I've said a couple of times, and it's a 5-year program. We're halfway through. This is the point at which we're not trying to claim victory over everything. This is the point at which we're trying to say, here's some lessons from those first few years, which have been very hard. Rather than go through the same description of the program as I did yesterday, I thought I'd come at it from a slightly different angle. We were saying people in poverty don't just face one issue at a time. They often have to go to all sorts of different support services. Sometimes they're forced to do that one at a time. Sometimes they need them all at the same time. Sometimes they're in parallel discussions, giving their story and having to go through assessment and eligibility criteria with multiple different people. It can be really difficult for them to navigate the system. And a commonly proposed solution to this is that we need to have different eligibility criteria or assessment to make sure everyone knows exactly what things are doing. It's quite common for me to hear people say things like, let's make sure there's no duplication in this neighborhood. Every organization should do just one specialism. I'm not sure that's always right. It's also quite common to hear the proposal that because there's so many services, and any neighborhood like the ones we work in, where there's say 5,000 people, will have dozens, maybe hundreds of public services and third sector services that are active or available in that space. And commonly people say, well, maybe we need more mapping of that. Maybe we need more signposting, more information sharing. Or they say, maybe we should have fewer providers and it should be simpler. It should be very simple. And I'm not clear that's really an equity-based approach. It's an approach that gives people an advantage if they can deal with literally a 1,000-page document that helps try to explain what all the different services are and how you could get to them and what they're eligible for. I've seen 1,000-page documents try and do this for really quite small spaces. I'm not clear that that is the solution. And then when we do turn up to support services, and this slide takes health as an example, but there's no reason to label health as this. We all do this, including ourselves sometimes. It's intuitive. When we turn up, people start to talk to us in what we were calling yesterday the fix-it paradigm. They might casually say the most natural thing someone who looks like they need help, how you introduce yourself, might say, how can I help you? And hidden in that is a power dynamic that we maybe start addressing. Look, how can I help you? Puts the emphasis. There's a power dynamic. I'm here to do the helping. You're here to do the being helped. Okay. The idea of being helped at all is already in that kind of. It assumes that the person's come in knowing what the thing that they need doing is. It's not an opener to a real deep listening conversation. And yeah, that's, not across the board, but this is an approach that we see all over the place. And then when we sometimes say, well, okay, could we not be a bit more relationship centered and person centered around this? Let's be nice about it. We maybe just add in, yeah, we know a bit about you. Hi, Sharon, how's your dog? Yeah, great. How can I help you? And then we say a person centered version is maybe giving them some flexibility. I'm not clear that that gets the heart of people's issues, particularly when they face multiple disadvantage, when there's lots going on, and when you get into a deep conversation with them, actually their priorities might be completely different from what you thought. So what would community development minded people do if they were operating these kind of services that traditionally say, how can I help you? Well, not everyone in community development is perfect, and not everyone is wrong who's delivering one-to-one services. We'd be the first to say that. We do both. But what might they start to say if we were taking a community development mindset? Well, we might start to focus on what assets are there in a person's life and in a neighborhood. We would be implicitly saying there's things that need to be done, there's things you need to do, but we'd be taking a kind of as positive a spin on it as we could and trying to place people in that community in control. We'd be trying to say, we don't just want to help one person, we want to have some momentum behind helping multiple people who can maybe start helping themselves and each other. Let's try to make it so we get to a point where there's maybe a tipping point where a community is able to support itself better. This is the sort of thinking that we were doing leading up to launching this program. And as yesterday, I should reinforce that the heart of what we're doing is that we're offering whole person support. So all of the spiel I've just been talking about often boils down to saying, look, we've got a team with people who've got skills in these areas and understand things are difficult. They're skilled in listening, connecting, building on people's strengths and sticking with them. And then they can try to support people holistically. The question we really run up to, and Paul and Sheila yesterday did a role play to try to demonstrate what one of our holistic assessments conversations would look like, although albeit that they needed to do so quite quickly. It's all leading up to trying to get someone to answer truthfully and deeply what they think inside, what a much better life would look like in 18 months' time. Just an example of trying to say, let's do transformation. Let's not do incremental change or take people on a journey where we assume that each time we interact with them, they move one step forward in a linear path. Let's see what transformation we can do. And let's see how much we can put them in the hot seat for being the source of their own change. What do they need from us to help that happen? Sometimes they need some structure. Sometimes they need some challenge. Sometimes they just need a shoulder to cry on or someone to help listen to them. So that toolkit that Paul and Sheila were so eloquently describing yesterday in their role play looks at things like, what do you do in your social life? How do you connect with your family and your relationships? What do you do with yourself? What skills do you have? It looks at your wellness and your self-care capacity. It doesn't use those aren't the questions. They're asked in a much more subtle way, but tries to get to the bottom of that. And today, Paul is going to do a workshop later. And if you're interested in knowing how we really get to the bottom of whole person working and whole person thinking, that'll be a really interesting workshop to go into to get some practical lessons, which is important for today's purposes. So if we're going to have a team of people that do whole place working, well, rather than do this kind of just help people navigate one at a time or show there's a maze, what can we do to make sure we're saying that people should be having all the support they need around them all the time? Well, what if our team that we were bringing together, and we call it a neighborhood transformation team that we have active in Bingham, Magdalen, and the Hayes, which is this neighborhood of 5,000 people, which is our test of change neighborhood. What if our team had people from a whole range of disciplinary backgrounds? What if some of them were advice workers? What if some of them were employment support workers? What if some of them knew a bit more about community development or community arts? What about older people or younger people? Is there sort of a group that we could gather that would be more multidisciplinary and therefore have more insight into the system that sort of sits behind each of those disciplinary areas, but also maybe more insight into that individual person's needs on that day? You could create a relationship with one person in the team that was very strong, but maybe that team member could be the one who themselves goes and asks for support in, for instance, case conferencing, or just chatting around, having a cup of tea one day with their colleagues and says, look, I've got this real problem with someone. I was wondering whether there's more support available. I don't know, that's about social isolation. And someone else says, yeah, no, I know all about that. I'm really well connected in that area. I know about some techniques that you could use that would really help them get on. And what if, therefore, we could take the same approach going out in concentric circles? What if instead of us referring and signposting people out or giving them a flyer for other services when we want them to use them, what if we were able to do introductions instead? What if we're able to not refer or signpost, but do introductions? The biggest bit that we're doing that's a huge challenge for us, but we wanted to bite off really more than we can chew in order to create learning and lessons that would be valuable, is we said, well, what if we tried to do this not with new resource, not by gathering 12 new posts, and that was the size of team we were envisaging, although in practice we've ended up smaller, and mostly because of COVID. But instead of having 12 new people, all of whom are like brand new recruits and fresh, and we take them all on this journey, that would mean we were proposing, if others were going to copy what we did, they all needed to come with huge, tens of millions of pounds each just for a single tiny neighborhood. And you know what? That's probably the right thing that we should do as a country. But it's not reasonable that thousands of examples of that might spring up. Instead, we're saying, what if people thought about redeploying existing resource? So we looked in our own team and said, well, look, we kind of had a bit of a community development structure there. We've been in Bingham, Magdalen, and the Hayes for a lot longer than 2 years. We've been there for close to 8. So we said, well, we have employment support workers. They're funded through one contract. We have people who deliver welfare rights advice. We have people who work with younger people. We have community development workers. What if instead we said, yeah, okay, they do have their own KPIs, but why don't we put them inside the neighborhood transformation team and try to cotton wool ball, hide them off in a cultural container that could have this whole person, whole place, whole system thinking going on without having to worry too much about things like KPIs, because they naturally flow from this process of working. Getting people into work is a natural outcome of having a team work in an interdisciplinary way. And then we said, well, what if we get into that team some people from public services, and in fact, third sector services as well? What if other people were able to join that team? And initially we were talking about having secondments into that team. We thought that was the right approach. COVID really threw us. We had 13 people lined up to join at least part-time in that team from the public and third sector in Bingham and Magdalen and the Hayes. Not all of those would have worked out, but many of them would. And then COVID happened literally a month after we started on that journey. So we've had some problems, and we've turned that into something called time donoring. And I'll come back to that in the learning section, because that in itself has created a few problems. But where we do have people, for instance, from Citizens Advice Bureau who are in that team, we have people from DWP and Social Security Scotland who co-locate in the team. But they're on the fringes of the cultural container as what we call a time donor. They're not completely in the middle. But what if we could learn lessons about how we could move them inside that cultural container? And we're somewhere along that journey, and I'm hoping we're going to get that by the if you come to the conference at the end of this program, I'm hoping we'll have some real juicy lessons around that, rather than just this emerging thinking. And this slide, please don't think you're meant to read this. This slide is just capturing a conversation we had in 2020 with the team around what they thought was needed to happen. And all I wanted to reflect is that once you start saying, oh my goodness, we have to take this place-based approach, every single topic area you look at is rich with things you need to think about. Each person in the team sometimes has what they might describe as an overwhelming amount to think about in terms of the perspective you need to take. If you're going to work with families, there's a whole range of different topics you need to have in mind as a worker there. And instead of just being a family worker, someone's part of this team, so they're working with all sorts of people. I'm just trying to reflect that a whole system approach is really important, and bringing it together on a place base is hugely important, but it's actually challenging and can be somewhat overwhelming. Alongside the fact that we provide one-to-one support, the difference in our neighborhood transformation team is a whole place approach that's based on the idea of saying we're going to engage the community members actively and proactively. We do community events. We make sure community projects are set up with volunteers. We help existing community groups like this gardening group. We help existing ideas that come out of the community, like let's paint some things. We help those flourish and bring people together. More importantly, we do it systematically. We do door knocking, and we're just starting our journey, as I was saying yesterday, about how we use data to try to target some of that support. But we do it systematically. For 20 years, since that very first learning cycle, we've done street work where we just hang out on street corners and speak to people in the neighborhoods we work in. And we've done door knocking where we literally tap on their door and we get into a conversation. A systematic approach can be transformational in terms of its prevention and early intervention work. We think that that work, because it's about being out there and being seen by the community and forming relationships with them, shouldn't be done by a bunch of headhunters who go off and try to do that work and then come back. We think it should be done by the same people in that neighborhood transformation team. The people that maybe previously would have said, look, I've got 12 appointments today. I'm just going to sit in my room and have a waiting room outside, and I'm going to get through them as best I can. And each one's going to be a heartbreaking story, and hopefully I've helped them at the end of the day. That is an efficient way of working. There's no two ways about it. But it doesn't place the work in the context of the community. It doesn't mean that that worker then says when someone comes in, oh, yeah, you're talking about, yeah, like, I know your area well. I know the shops you're talking about. I know the play park you're talking about. I know the kids groups you're talking about. Or you've met them and formed a relationship with them. There's a balance to be struck around how we use specialists in this space. But our neighborhood transformation team is to say, let everyone roll up their sleeves. It's going to be hard work, but everyone get involved in this community engagement work, the systematic work, as well as the one-to-one work as best we can. Going door to door can sound obvious and easy, but in one of the workshops, Sheila's going to talk through what we call the listening survey, which is to say, we've learned both the hard way and the good way that it takes a real bit of skill to do door knocking. Staff who just go out and do it will inevitably not nail it first time. And the work we've been doing, which is about replicating our program in Newcastle through another partner, where we're trying to take a back seat and just teach them our learning and lessons and see to what extent they can kind of copy our approach, was fascinating, because early on they were so excited and they got out and they knocked 1,000 doors and almost no one engaged the program. And then we said, oh, we really need to do the training program with you again. We need you to know that this is a subtle art, and it's one we've done for 20 years. Right, in practice, this has been difficult. Of course, it's been a difficult program. We had COVID. We started the program in earnest in February 2020, effectively. And in March 2020, it immediately went in a different direction. We did loads of fantastic learning in that period, in the sense that the community changed a lot. There was loads of interesting things happened. In particular, the strength of our connections to community groups suddenly transformed overnight. People who were maybe a little bit, thought we were maybe stepping on their toes, said, God, we've got to come together and try to just adapt and do whatever we can to help people through this COVID emergency. I've already hinted that the team, our neighborhood transformation team, is smaller than we expected as a result, and I'll come on to that in a second. We've also had, as lots of third sector organizations have in the last, particularly 6 months, but last 24 months as well, we've had significant team turnover. For instance, we've got recruitment and retention issues. Every networking session I go to at the minute is full of other charity chief executives saying, gosh, recruitment retention is really difficult at the minute. Of course, we've had that. The first bit of learning I want to draw attention to is that we've come across a lot of this talk around not while we're all in crisis. Well, that's because we started in 2020 and we just had 2 years of crisis. We've now got a cost of living crisis, which certainly is a crisis. And if anything, I think cost of living is understating how much of a crisis it is. That's a risk of dying crisis. We say cost of living for some reason. So it's completely fair enough that in 2020, lots of people who were going to join that team, who worked, for instance, we're talking about working with unpaid, working in family support team, said, look, we just need to get through this. We're going to have to work from home, but also need has completely changed. Our own team, there's so much going on. Please, can we just wait? Let's not change the system just now, not while we're in crisis. But through COVID, the system did change in all sorts of unexpected and sort of unintentional ways. And we sort of settled back in, but now there's more crisis. But if you think about 2019, was it that we had no crisis? We had massive inequity. We had housing issues. We had issues with benefits then. We had issues with people not being able to afford food then. We had responses already coming in the community to try to get people warmer spaces and food on their plates. Like there was crisis then, there's always crisis. So I think we're getting to the stage where we're finding it useful to go into rooms and say, so hang on, when's this time that there's not a crisis? And what is it the thing that will make it so when there is a crisis, we don't have to completely abandon some of the things that were happening and do something different? What can we do that will stop that cycle that will go on forever? And you know, the more we challenge and talk about it, the more people say, yeah, that's what we thought too. We just haven't necessarily said it. It turns out everyone we're speaking to is thinking the same, if you see what I mean. So there's that sense of inertia through crisis, but actually when we're speaking to people, it turns out everyone's of the same mindset. Let's be preventative, early intervention. Let's talk about system change so we don't have to go crisis to crisis. Although, as I said a moment ago, and I'll not linger on this slide as a result, actually a bit of crisis can be useful for getting people kind of warmed up and in gear. Our team did amazing work on the ground during the COVID crisis. And I think they all had a sense that they were making that huge change happen. It was great. The community connections we made were useful as a result. In the cost of living crisis, I can see people coming together in the third sector and the public sector to find multidisciplinary approaches. They have great multi-agency approaches to the Ukrainian crisis as well that we're loosely involved in. You know, these things with the refugees coming to Edinburgh specifically, you know, crisis can help in some ways, but a crisis mentality cannot help. I'm just going to come back to what I was talking about before about secondment. So we're basically going both ways on whether having this multidisciplinary team made up, certainly the internal secondments as they were, where we've said, look, you know, you do need to work and make sure we're, as an organization, thinking about the KPIs around your contract, but you as workers, please don't. In fact, I had a great meeting on Tuesday with the team, and I was basically saying, you don't need, none of those numbers mean anything to you. They mean something to me. We'll deal with that. You should be insulated from that in your cultural container. But getting secondments in from public and third sector into that team was always a challenge. That was one of the biggest challenges we had. I think everything I describe around our whole place, whole person, whole system thinking is probably intuitive to you, thinking, yeah, of course, we all want to work in this paradigm. That's great. We just chose to bite off this extra big bit of crunchy material to try to deal with it. And in some ways, that's because it elucidates the extreme cases of some of this learning, if you see what I mean. And that's, I hope, going to be really useful, certainly by the end of the program, but it's already, we're finding useful. One of the bits is that we started by saying, if we ask public agencies to second people into this team, even part-time, it's a big ask, isn't it? They're saying we need to make sure that person who has their own team and KPIs and things can do as much useful work in the same area, topic area. Let's say it was public health, for instance. They need to do as much as they were going to do there in this team, or that needs to be then a collective effort amongst the team. It is a big ask on a technicality. Instead, because we saw COVID was just taking away the opportunities to get out that crisis mentality, we started talking about time donors. We said, what if you had people who kind of volunteered a bit of their time? We'll make it a bit looser. That sounds like an easier thing to sign up to. And as a result, we have secured some time donors. In fact, in Newcastle, we've got we had a very small number recently. And in Newcastle, where this replication work is being done by a partner, they suddenly have 9 people clamoring to join their team. There's something in that time donor model, but we've learned that it also, the word time donor sounds like volunteering a bit. It sounds a bit more like co-location. It doesn't bring them quite into the cultural container. It doesn't mean they're desperate to share the workload around community events, for instance, or door knocking, or even just that kind of multidisciplinary meetings. And part-time work, where it's very part-time, can be hard to get anything done because it's long enough just to do case conferencing or just have a team meeting, for instance. There's some work around this, and we've kind of flip-flopped around secondment and time donoring and how we do that. Maybe we're back to saying a model around secondment might be better, because then at least things like data sharing is coped with in a much more realistic way. Job descriptions and people's expectations are managed a bit better. So we're umming and ahhing about this, but certainly the idea that there can be change and people can come in is something we're already seeing. But of course there's challenges. No one will be surprised to hear that. In our neighborhood transformation team, we have this dynamic. Community development is an organic process, right? Community development needs to say, oh, look, we sniff an opportunity over there. We're going to pursue it with some community members. When you're curious with someone who's in front of you and you're listening to them and they start talking about something that's going to be beneficial for both of you, it's vital that everyone in the team can just pursue that course of learning, course of action. That needs flexibility, a sort of organic nature. But we've discovered that basically when we take away structured things, so saying, you know what, this contract you've got is all about having particular meetings in a certain way, and you need to do a certain bit of database entry in a certain kind of tick box form. When you take away too much of that structure, it kind of leaves people in a bit of a panic. It kind of gives the sense of what's the framework by which they can go home at the end of the week and think, yeah, okay, I've done what I was meant to do. So I always like Sagrada Familia in the sense that it's one of the most rigid, huge structures in Europe, and yet feels extremely organic. I think we need to get to that balance where we can give the right amount of structure and the right amount of organic flexibility. And then there is this question of what happens when people have no target. It's not that the team and the program doesn't have a target, but the individual members should feel none of that, because otherwise that can be difficult. One of the things I've found recently is that in the absence of targets, people have imposed their own extremely high and unachievable targets. They're expecting so much of themselves that they go home on a Friday and think, I haven't even got close to what I needed to do. And yet from our perspective, they might have done a great job. Or it might be that as a result of that desperation, they've missed something we really did need of them. So it's a long and arduous road to integration in a multidisciplinary team. There are some easy wins. We found that adding some case conferencing in and allocation meetings of caseload, that was a structure that made a big difference towards that integration. We just, it might seem extremely obvious. Lots of people will be like, well, of course you should have done that. Took us longer maybe to learn that, but integration is long and arduous. We've had the Tavistock Institute try to help us, which is, really going to some of the biggest, greatest experts around this integration and systems thinking work to say, how can we better work as a team? And, it's eye-opening to think of all the many things we need to do to just make integration happen. It doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't happen just by taking away targets or putting people in a room. It's a huge amount of work, and there's no leader who won't already know that, but it is a huge amount of work. And we're starting to think, well, how do we build this into people's job descriptions to make sure they've got clarity on how they should spend their week and their time? You need to balance up door knocking, but if you spend 5 days door knocking, you've done none of the actual transformational work. Maybe we need to sort that out a little bit. Are we asking a lot of them? One of the last things I'm going to just talk about is the size of the team. So I've loosely just been saying, look, we've got 5,000 people in Bingham Magdalen in the Hayes that we're trying to support. It's one of the most deprived neighborhoods in Scotland. And we thought maybe 12 people would be a great team size to try to break the back of poverty in that neighborhood over a 5-year period. Those numbers weren't out of thin air. We'd worked for 20 years doing lots of the elements of this. This wasn't invented overnight. It was invented over 20 years of learning. And it felt about right. Critical for me isn't a number of team size and neighborhood size. It's that the neighborhood is small enough that it's reasonable for people who are working in the team to know most things about most things in the neighborhood at any one time. If you try to work across 100,000 people, 500,000 people, there's no way you could have a sense of all the stuff that's going on. You need to have that village mentality. That's how humans work. They can only cope with a few hundred connections at a time. So keep it small enough that the team size can be, they know each other really well and are well supported with each other, so not too big, but also where each individual member of the team doesn't feel overwhelmed by the size of the neighborhood. And a question that I'm going to ask in the workshop I'm running later is, whose job is it to find people preventatively? This has come up time and time again, where we say, it's completely reasonable for you to say, well, why is it, John, that you're saying that someone who's a specialist in youth work should go out and do door knocking with people where we might know there are older people behind those doors? Yeah, it's a problem. We need to think about it. But I find people come back to me and say, is there not someone out there in the system that does door knocking and street work and then could maybe hook you up? Is there not some sort of signposting service that could do this? And I always say, well, if the person you speak to on the doorstep isn't someone who knows what they're talking about and isn't someone who can, in the grand scheme of things, support you in any way, so what's the point in knocking on their door? You're just creating another person and another service to have a relationship with. But it is a genuine and worthy challenge. And then I'm just going to tee up Gary, who's our next speaker, effectively, who I'm going to introduce in just one moment. We found that when we were saying the members of our team that are working don't need to worry too much about their KPIs and things, there was somewhat of an exaggeration in that, for instance, they have to go onto a particular database and go through a particular routine of registering people because that's where some of the funding comes from. We're not an organization where we have lots of core funding and lots of flexibility. The advantage of that is that probably resonates more with lots of you. You might be in the same position where you're not starting from a nice, fresh, clean start. In doing so, we've discovered that in both Newcastle and Edinburgh, what's happened is that we've found that commissioners have absolutely tried to do the right thing and have tried to sort of set out contracts and public sector delivery. And it's not just the contracts we have, by the way, we see this across the system. See delivery, where they've said, well, look, we're going to try to get out of the way as best we can. But here we do need a few outcomes and we do have a few eligibility criteria. So there's just a minor bit of gatekeeping, but their role is massive. You'll be unsurprised to hear that the very small amount of European Social Fund money that was used and integrated into the team in Newcastle caused untold difficulties. And there's a problem there where just a small bit that's not working and is completely not a community development mindset or an organic mindset can spoil the whole integration of the program. So it's incumbent on us to say, we need to share our platform with people who can talk to commissioners to say, look, it's not that you're doing things wrong, your intents are right, but somewhere between commissioning and procurement, there's sort of a bit of a mix-up maybe, or some mindset is lost. But there's actually practical ways that you can make it so whole person, whole place, whole system thinking is both helped by your actions, but also you kind of get out of the way of the place-based working that might otherwise be hindered by you. So we thought we'd share our stage with Gary just now from Plymouth.